In this video, we're going to set up the entire input system for a character and very basic movement. The way inputs are set up drastically changed with Unreal Engine 5.1, but since we are using 5.3, we are already able to use the enhanced input action system and it's active by default. Let's have a look at the settings first though. Go to Edit, Project Settings, and here we can now look for Engine and Input. And you can see here at the top, the axis and action mappings are now deprecated. This is the old system we used before 5.1. However, if you scroll down now, you can see here under the default classes, the default player input class is now the enhanced player input, and we also have the enhanced input component as the default value. This means that we are using the enhanced input action system, which became the default with Unreal Engine 5.1. This system is a little bit complicated and takes some time to set up, but it actually is very powerful and it gives you many new functions out of the box that we're actually also going to make use of throughout this course. Okay, let's set it up now. We can close out here and we can also close the player. And in the content drawer, we want to go to content and right click to create a new folder and just call it input. And in here, we want to have another folder called actions. And the enhanced input system basically has two different asset types. We can just go into actions here and right click, go to input, and you can see the input action and the input mapping context. These are the two asset types we're going to use to create this mapping. First, we want to have an input action, and let's just start with a simple one, just called IA for input action underscore jump. And if you open this up, you can see that there's a couple of settings. And usually we don't change most of these. The only important one is value type. And you can see by default, this is digital bool. So this basically means that this action is a regular button, like maybe the space bar, that can either be pressed or not be pressed. And that is what a bool means. Otherwise, we have axis 1D. This means it could be either left or right, for example. It could have a -1 value and a +1 value. We have axis 2D, which could be left, right, up, down. And then we have axis 3D, which is something more complicated like a motion controller. So maybe in the smartphone, the motion controller or motion controllers for VR games. And this is what we have to set up for the value type. But again, the jumping is just a very simple button. It could just be pressed or not. So this digital bool is fine for here. Let's go back here and create another input for the movement. So here again, right click, input action IA underscore move, and double click to open it up. And like I just said before, if we have something that could have left and right, so could have multiple inputs, we want to use axis 1D. In our game, we can only walk left and right. We cannot walk up and we cannot walk down. So we actually don't need the axis 2D. We just need left and right. So axis 1D is the correct one here. Just select it and save and close this down. Okay, so now we set up the actions for our jumping and our moving, and those are the two we want to concentrate on now. As we implement the shooting or other actions, we can just put them in here as well. But we also need to bind them now. So we can go back to input, right click here, go to input, and now we need the input mapping context. And we're going to call this IMC underscore action for action game. Double click to open it up. And I can just move this over here. And we now need to bind all of the input actions that we created to a button. So here for the mappings, we can just press on plus and need to open this up here. And here, instead of none, we can first start with the jump. So just select the IA jump and we can then open this up here and we need to set the button we want. And I actually want to set this to the space bar. But I also want to have this on a different button because spacebar is a little bit hard to use once we also have shooting and other actions implemented. So we can just press on plus here again. And now we have a second input here. And I like to use K for this. And yeah, I like to use K for jumping and J for shooting. But the shooting we're going to implement later. And you can see here we have triggers, modifiers, all of these things we don't have to worry about now. Let's set up the movement as well. So next to mappings, click on plus. And select the IA move here. And now we need to have an input for right and an input for left. So let's start off with right first. So click here. And then on the keyboard, press D for right because we want to use the WASD controls. And here we don't have to change anything for the modifiers, triggers. This is just fine. because for an axis 1D, the default direction is right. And D is the right direction, so we don't have to change anything. Then we press plus again and add A. So click here, press A on the keyboard for left. And here we actually do have to change something. Because A is the left direction, which is not the default for an axis 1D, we have to go to modifiers, click on plus, and there's a lot of different modifiers here. A lot of them you're not going to use, but the one you use all the time is negate. So this means it's going to flip around the input to be left, so for A. And this is all we need to do in the IMC here. So we can save and exit out. But this is still not enough. We just prepared the assets, but even now, again, I start the game, I still cannot do anything. We also need to tell this player character, this blueprint, to actually use this action mapping. So we can go to blueprints, characters, and again, we don't need this for the action char because the enemies aren't going to use this, only the player. Open up the BP player, and on begin play, which is either when the game starts or when this blueprint is being spawned in, we actually want to set up the binding. Here we want to right click and get controller like this and cast to player controller and just connect this. And this is just a pattern that you have to remember. And here we can look for subsystem to get enhanced input local player subsystem like this. And then look for add mapping context and connect this here. So yeah, we get the controller, cast it to a player controller, get the subsystem, and then add the mapping context on it. And this is just a pattern that you kind of have to remember or just look it up. And very important here for the mapping context, we have to select our IMC action or nothing is going to work. Because you can actually have multiple mapping contexts available at the same time, and this is why you have the priority. But for a simple game like this is nothing we have to worry about. And now that this is set up, we can first delete this action overlap and tick because we're not going to use it for now. And we can just right click and first look for our IA jump. Right, this enhanced action events, IA jump. And this gives us this whole thing with a triggered action value, and you can actually open it up and it's going to show you much more options. And there are actually some subtle differences depending on if we use triggered or started. And for the jump, we want to use started. And from start, just drag off and look for jump, which is a pre-made function from Unreal Engine on the character class. And now we can just compile and save and go to the map and press play. And very important, if I press the button now, nothing happens. If you want to control the game, you actually have to click inside of the viewport once. And this is something some beginners forget, and then they think that the input mapping doesn't work. Very important, click into the viewport. And now I can press jump, and you can see the character jumps. This is still very floaty and it feels very bad, but it actually recognizes our input and executes the action we set. And we want to go here, and from canceled, we actually want to stop jumping. And this becomes very important once we implement the hold jump, so we can hold to jump longer. But we already want to set this up because this is the basic setup for jumping. Let's now set up the IA move. So we can go down here, I'll open up some space here, and right click, look for IA_move, which is our enhanced input action event. And again, we can open this up to get all of the options. For moving though, we don't want to use started because started only happens when we press the button, but movement should also happen while we keep holding the button. So here we actually want to use triggered. And for this, we can again use a function that is available on the character. So from triggered, we can just look for add movement input. Here, input, add movement input, very simple. And here, for the scale value, we just use the action value. And this is, like I said before, the float 1D. So this could either be -1 for left, or 1 for right, or 0 for nothing on a keyboard. But if you use a gamepad, it could also be something like 0.2 if you just tilt the stick slightly, or if you tilt the stick slightly to the left, maybe 0.5, -0.5, and things like that. So we can just get this axis value and put it into the scale value. But very important, we also need to set the world direction because otherwise it doesn't know like which direction we want to walk into. And since we make a simple 2D game, we just have to put in 1 for X. Because this is the left and right direction in the world, we can go to the map and you can see the player start here, right? and you can see this red axis. So this is the x-axis, and we want the character to only be able to walk here left and right. We don't want to walk up and down, right? So this is why we just put the 1.0 for x and have 0 on y and 0 on z. And this is all we need for this. So we can just compile and save, go to the map, again click into the viewport, very important, and now click on A for left, D for right, and yeah, we can move around, we can jump while moving as well, and this is how we set this up. But of course we want the character to turn into the direction we're walking, and this is actually also very easy to set up. And we only need to worry about turning left and right while we are using an input, right? So we just want to check, was the last input a right input or a left input, and then turn the character around depending on that. And for deciding if we turn the character left or right, we simply have to check for this action value, and we have to check if it is greater or equal than 0, and this would mean yes, we want to go right, and if this is not the case, then we want to go left. But how do we do that? So we can get controller, and this is specific for players only. This does not work on NPCs, so for the NPCs we're going to use a different method later. And here we can just set control rotation like this and connect. And we then want to use this, well, we could use a branch, right? So here we can use a branch, which is like a true or false statement, right? So we could have true and go into a certain direction, and on false go in a different direction. But there's actually a cleaner way of doing this. We can just drag off here from the new rotation and select and get the utility select. And this basically, if we connect here to the wildcard, lets us make a shortcut. So we don't have to use a branch, we can simply put the values here. And well, both methods are fine, but I just prefer this one personally. And we can then decide which value we want to use if we're going to the right, and which value you want to use if we go to the left. So here we can just drag off and make rotator all the way at the bottom. And well, if we are looking to the right, we don't have to change the rotation. 0, 0, 0 is the default, so this is fine. But if we want to go to the left, we can just Control C, Control V, copy and paste this. We want to change the yaw to 180 to turn in the other direction, right? So again, we just check for the action value. If the last input was bigger or equal than 0, this means we are going to the right. This means we also want to turn towards the right. If this is not the case, we're going towards the left, we want to turn towards the left. And we execute this on the set control rotation. Can just compile and save. And check this out. I go right, the character looks right, I go left, the character flips around. So this is fine, the character flips around, but the camera also flips around, which is something we don't want. And there's actually an easy fix for this. But first, we confirm that this works properly. So we can just select all of these, select these, hold shift, select the other ones, and we can just collapse them. So here we can just right click one of these and collapse to function. And just call it update rotation. I just had a typo, update rotation, and drag this up here. Double click the line here to create a reroute node. Yeah, just keep it clean. And we don't want this to be called A, we want this to be called direction. Well, direction in the sense of if it's minus, it's left. If it's plus, it's right. And yeah, so all of the stuff is still in here. But we just finished this. We never have to worry about this again. This is completed, so we just collapse it into a function. It's also available on the left side here now, and this just makes it look cleaner and more manageable. But let's now take care of the camera. So we can go to the viewport, we can look at the spring arm, and we want the spring arm to basically ignore the rotation of the capsule component and of the actor as a whole. And this is actually very easy to do. We can just go to the transform rotation and set this from relative to world, which will then be shown as absolute rotation. And this just means it is always going to keep this rotation. It's going to ignore what the capsule, what the actor and everything else does. So just compile and save, go back, I go right, it's fine. I go left, it is also fine. I'm turning around, but the camera is ignoring whatever the character is doing. And this is the basic setup for our input system. So congrats on coming this far. This is a little bit hard to wrap your head around at first, but you're going to use this in all of your projects. You're going to get more used to it. You're going to start to understand the amazing features this gives us, even if it's a little bit of a pain to set up in the first place. However, you also notice that even if we can walk around and jump, it doesn't really look that way because we're just playing the idle animation on the character. So the next chapter is going to be very interesting because we're going to use PaperZD to set up the animation tree to make the character animate depending on if we're walking, if we're jumping, if we're falling. So please look forward to that lesson.